Good evening and welcome to today's virtual presentation, X-rays at 125 years, in honor of the 125th anniversary of its discovery. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your question to today's presenter. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. As time allows, Mr. Allard will address as many questions as he can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now to introduce our presenter, Dave Allard is the Director of Bureau of Radiation Protection. He has been involved in various aspects of governmental, industrial, reactor, medical, and academic radiation protection for over 40 years. And he's a huge history buff. So you're gonna have a really full hour of very informative information about 125 years of radiation. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce Mr. Allard, and we hope you enjoy.
Great, thanks, Julia. I first want to thank the College of Physicians in Philadelphia for sponsoring this. This is a fun presentation. I also want to thank Julia and Samantha for all their help, all the technical support in putting this webinar together, which is a lot of work, I'm sure. This is actually a presentation, a fun presentation I did about 25 years ago for the 100th anniversary of the discovery of X-rays. And it's evolved. I've done it a few times. The first time I presented was on 35mm slides, which I still have, but it's a fun presentation. I hope you enjoy it. This week in particular, in addition to this year being the 25th anniversary of the discovery of X-rays, this is Radiation Professionals Week. And so the Health Physics Society, the Association of Medical Physicists, the National Council on Radiation Protection, the American Association of Radiologic Technologists, all these groups typically put out a statement and a resolution honoring all the folks working in radiation protection. In particular, these times with this in the middle of this pandemic, I'd like to honor and offer up this presentation for all the frontline healthcare workers, and in particular, again, the radiologic technologists, the radiologists, medical physicists, medical health physicists that are working to protect everybody. And allowing the benefits to humankind for the use of X-rays in medical diagnosis. So with no further ado, we have a slight disclaimer here. No conflicts of interest. Any opinions are mine. So the objectives of this presentation, just a quick overview of the history of discovery of X-rays with Röntgen's discovery in 1895, and honoring Röntgen and Coolidge, who greatly advanced the technology, and you'll see this brief, and I really want to kind of focus on Dr. Coolidge's life and his major inventions during his lifetime, and review some of the technical aspects of what his innovation, this hot cathode, or Coolidge tube, as it was called in the day, did to greatly improve the technology. And then I just have a few slides at the end to illustrate the wide use of X-rays and that we see in medical, academic, and industrial applications. So, first person I have to thank is Dr. Coolidge's son, the late Dr. Lawrence Coolidge, who was an economist out in Boulder back in '95. My wife and I spent a day with Dr. Coolidge, and he provided a great deal of reference material on his father, and he gave me a number of reference books and materials, and it was just a great time visiting with Dr. Coolidge back in '95 and talk about his father. So we have, and we're all constantly bathed in radiation. If we don't know that, we have cosmic rays coming in from the sun outside the solar system. We see these show up beautifully with Aurora Borealis, the northern lights, where these particles interact with the atmosphere. In the sun, in fact, and from outside the solar system, we were again bathed in particles and X-rays, which we cannot see, could not see, and didn't even know were out there until these late 1800s. Fortunately for us, on the Earth, we have a magnetic field which protects us from the really high levels out in space. So in the late 1800s, a fellow by the name of Crookes had invented a tube, a high vacuum glass tube, and was looking at these particles called cathode rays. Later on, Röntgen, utilizing the similar tube, discovered X-rays. Shortly after that, Becquerel began to working with looking at possibly X-rays coming from uranium and discovered radioactivity. And very shortly after that, the Curies discovered polonium and radium. And all this happened in very, very quick sequence. It was really sort of the cusp of physics going from classical physics to the modern atomic physics that we all know today. So here's a good example of Crookes tube, where you put a high voltage, use these induction transformers, induction coils rather, produce a very high voltage, thousands of volts. And you left a little bit of gas in the tube, and that was the source of the electrons or cathode rays, which could strike an object and cast a shadow. And Crookes was honored through his lifetime, physicist, for this work and with cathode rays, which led to another physicist in Germany, a fellow by the name of Lenard. He put a window on this Crookes tube, which actually allowed the cathode rays to escape the high vacuum tube into the air. Now, these cathode rays or electrons have a very short range, and Lenard was working with an imaging device that would glow, and he could see the range of these particles as they came out, and could put various materials in front of them, attenuate those electrons and such. And then came along Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen in the fall of 1895, started to repeat some of Lenard's experiments. And you can see a picture of Röntgen's laboratory in Würzburg, where he was a physicist at the time. And here's a good example of another Crookes tube. And what Röntgen did and we don't know exactly the date, we say we tag it as November 8th, and that came out of an article from an interview, but I'm not sure if we're really clear when exactly in late October, early November, when Röntgen actually discovered X-rays. That's not totally clear. But he had set up this apparatus, Crookes tube with a window. He had a platinum barium cyanide screen on the table. It covered the tubes because this will rarefy, and you'll see light emitted from this cathode, this Crookes tube. And so it wouldn't interfere with his screen. And he had the screen laying on the table here. And as he proceeded with his experiment, he actually saw the screen glow, and it was quite a distance from the tube, and he knew something different was going on. And being a very excellent experimental physicist, and he had a lot of different work to his credit at the time, he started to experiment with these unknown rays, which he deemed as X-rays. And through the course of his work, he actually radiographed his shotgun, different weights, different inanimate objects, including his wife's hand. And his wife was actually hand was one of the first medical, well, not a medical, but a human image produced by X-rays. Now he did this work and then announced it in December in Würzburg. And it was just a huge discovery. Lots of print publications on this at the time, and 1896, early 96, 1896. And as you can imagine, we didn't have we didn't have the internet. We didn't have wide intercontinental telephone use. We had the telegraph. But the word quickly spread of this discovery, and the publications, popular and science journals, was immense at the time. Interestingly, a fellow in Philadelphia by the name of Goodspeed with a colleague, William Jennings, were doing a demonstration in 1890 with a Crookes tube, and they had placed two tokens on a photographic plate, and they used glass plates at the time. They developed this plate, and they saw these images of these tokens, and they thought it was just some electrical discharge effect from the tube or the coil. Just stuck it in a drawer, didn't think anything of it until January, February of 1896, and they saw this image, and it's like, oh wow, they missed the discovery of the century. And in fact, Crookes was actually returning glass plates to manufacturers when he was playing with his Crookes tubes, because they were fogged and they were defective. So Crookes probably saw some X-ray effects also. And this is one of the effects of radiation. It can pass through thick objects, metal objects. It gets differentially attenuated by metal and glass and tissue, and will cast a shadow. And again, good speed missed a huge discovery. So the tubes at the time were again these high vacuum tubes. They left a little bit of air inside, partially evacuated, and applied this very high voltage, and those air molecules provided the source of the electrons, which were accelerated from the cathode to the anode here, the cathode to the anode. And it's this interaction point at the anode where you create the X-rays, and these X-rays come out from that point, or if there's no anode in there, if it's impinging on the glass wall itself, you will get the X-rays from the wall of the tube. Some of the first X-rays in the United States were late January, early February. These two physician and physicists up in Dartmouth, actually this young boy had injured his wrist. Here's his mother, in the background, kind of watching all this. Well, we had a physicist and a physician team at Dartmouth, and they heard about these X-rays. And the interesting thing is that most of these physics labs had these induction coils and had these Crookes tubes. And they had photographic plates, and they were able to produce X-rays very, very quickly after the announcement of the discovery of X-rays. And here's one of the first, if maybe not the first, X-ray documented in the United States. Now, quickly after 1896, a fellow by the name of J.J. Thomson in the UK, England, famous physicist, and was again playing with the modified types of Crookes tubes. And he was able to put electric fields, and actually was able to determine that these cathode rays, which were known as electron, what they were, what their charge, their mass ratios, and such. And both Röntgen and J.J. Thomson got Nobel Prizes for their work. In fact, Röntgen got the first Nobel Prize in physics. Interesting, Röntgen didn't do a lot of work after that initial paper. His initial paper, he did, I think, one more paper on X-rays, and basically went back to other research. Again, there's a couple types of X-rays that can come out of an X-ray tube when you bombard a target with an electron beam. You can have what we call Bremsstrahlung, or braking radiation. It's German for braking radiation. It's a continuous spectrum of X-rays, or when the target atoms actually, the orbital electrons drop from one energy level to another, you can have what are called characteristic X-rays. And they're characteristic depending on the binding energy of the atom and the number of protons holding those electrons. So these come off at a single energy, they're monoenergetic. And this illustration shows that. So depending on the type of target you have, whether it's aluminum or molybdenum or tungsten, mostly tungsten these days, you get this spectrum of X-rays. And if you have a filter in there, you'll get this final spectrum, taking a lot of the low energy X-rays out, which really aren't useful. And then but you can have these peak characteristic X-rays depending on the type of target. So again, these early X-ray tubes were not very efficient. You didn't get a lot of electrons coming off the cathode, hitting the anode, producing these X-rays. And it took a long time to actually produce an image, whether it was an inanimate object sitting on a photographic plate or a kid's hand. And in fact, there was a lot of research in here. In fact, Thomas Edison got into experimenting with X-ray tubes. He was going to produce this fluorescent X-ray lamp, coat the inside of one of these tubes with a fluorescent material. In fact, Edison, the amazing inventor he was, who sorted through all sorts of possibilities with his inventions, sorted through hundreds, maybe thousands of compounds, and discovered that calcium tungstate was one of the best materials to convert X-rays, which are invisible, to visible light. And so Edison worked and produced these, what we call fluoroscopes. So there would be a coated screen on the inside. Here you dark adapt your eyes. your X-ray tube's down here, and here's Edison's assistant, Thomas Daly, and Edison's actually looking at his fingers. And this was actually the way people would calibrate these X-ray tubes too. They would put their hand in front of the X-ray tube, and they'd look at the image. And then often too, they'd see how long it took to actually cause reddening of the skin. And this was not good because, as we now know, ionizing radiation can produce biological effects on skin and other organs. And in fact, Thomas Daly was one of the first martyrs to X-rays. And Edison at that point, after Daly basically lost his hand, got cancer and died, gave up his work on X-rays. However, these damaging effects were quickly utilized for therapy, for X-ray therapy, treating cancers and such. So Fowler in Philadelphia is a good example of his work with applying these low energy X-rays to superficial cancer, skin cancers and such. In fact, he created some shields to protect the healthy skins and reduce the burns and such there. And in fact, and I have during the Spanish-American War, this is sort of a gruesome illustration, but because it took so long to take an image looking for bullets and such during the Spanish-American War, X-rays were utilized. The skin effects you can see here were pretty rough, and yes, the physician could see where the bullet was, didn't have to probe around and risking infections, things like that. But this was problematic. In fact, I have in my collection one of the copies of the Army that did, I think, the first manual on how to take X-rays during the Spanish-American War, and it's an interesting publication. And again, these fluoroscopes where you had calcium tungstate, there was a manufacturer here in Pennsylvania, Patterson, and I have one of these fluoroscopes in my collection. But again, you dark adapt your eyes, and you could do what we call fluoroscopy, where you'd put an image in front of the X-ray tube and look at that image with one of these fluoroscopes, whether it's handheld or mounted on your head. And here's a good example of some of the early X-ray laboratories that were out there. Kasabian's laboratory in Philadelphia. You can see him here with a fluoroscope, high voltage generator machine, X-ray tube here. And he had, a lot of times it was not even for medical diagnosis. It was for just amusement, which was unfortunate. Kasabian was another martyr to X-rays. He also died from his exposure to X-rays. So the state of the technology at the time, circa 1900, tube stability, because it was not a high vacuum, the vacuum wasn't well controlled. You had heat loading. A lot of the energy deposited on the target comes in the form of heat. The X-rays is actually very low. Most of the energy deposition shows up in heat, and the X-ray production wasn't really efficient in these early tubes. And then, of course, the operator protection. So here then, which brings me to my sort of the focus of this talk also is Dr. Coolidge. Dr. Coolidge, who invented the modern X-ray tube, and this is an example of one of his early Coolidge or hot cathode tubes. However, before I get into that, I do want to talk about his other work with lighting and light bulbs. But first, a little history on Dr. Coolidge. He was born in Hudson, Massachusetts, just west of Boston. He only child. His parents had a farm. He grew up in the area. Actually, quit high school to work folding raincoats in a factory in Hudson. However, he quickly realized that wasn't his thing and went back to high school and became valedictorian of his class and got a scholarship to go to MIT. Interestingly, a colleague of mine who knows I was researching Coolidge saw this stereo card on eBay several years ago, and here's little Willie Coolidge at 1 year old, with another dozen or so babies in the carriage, and this photographer has captured all these babies without moving. It's Morning Glories is the title of this, but here is Coolidge at 1 year old on a stereo card. I think this is just a great image. Coolidge again got a scholarship to go to MIT. studied physics, studied chemistry, and really made a mark at MIT. He went off to Germany, studied with renowned physicists in Germany, got his PhD from Leipzig. Under, I think Paul Drude was his PhD thesis advisor. Again, studying physical chemistry and physics and such. But again, he really made a mark in Germany. He lived with a family, learned the language, became an assistant to some of the physics professors and assisting setting up demonstrations in physics laboratories and such. And again, made a real mark during his PhD work. Returns, gets invited back to MIT to teach physics back at circa 1900. Here's his thesis on dielectric effects and different materials, all online. I don't speak or read German, but at some point I need to do a translation of this. While he's at MIT, one of his former professors, Willis Whitney, is now the research director at the newly formed General Electric. So General Electric was formed in the late 1800s, a combination of the Edison works and other electrical companies. They're in the Boston area, they're in Schenectady, New York. And here's Willis Whitney and Coolidge and Irving Lamure, who actually got a Nobel Prize in chemistry at the GE R&D lab. So Whitney invites Coolidge to come to the new GE R&D lab, and he had some student debt, and in fact, it was an offer he couldn't give up. And here's a layout of the GE complex production of Edison light bulbs, different electrical generating equipment and such. And they had this little tiny laboratory for R&D, and GE was one of these innovators in that area. So they were producing these Edison light bulbs, which were carbonized filaments, bamboo filaments and such, and they were very fragile and they didn't last very long. And a lot of researchers were focused on producing the better mousetrap or the better light bulb so they wouldn't burn out and be so fragile. And in fact, many researchers in Europe and GE was very, very focused on this. And this was one of the first tasks that Coolidge was given. Find a way to produce metal filaments. And they looked at all sorts of different materials, osmium and different things, but tungsten really stood out because of its temperature characteristics, its ability to conduct heat, and its great resistance. So when this is a tungsten wire, the great resistance is actually what causes the iridescence of that filament and the light emitted. So they were able to actually, in very short order, several years, produce a powdered material that they could extrude into these filaments. The problem with tungsten, it's not ductile, so you're not able to bend this thing into little filaments. So this was their big problem. So Coolidge and his team were able to make ductile tungsten. And in fact, the main areas of Coolidge's research over the years was tungsten metal processing, X-ray tubes, and electrical applications of these various types of materials. So Coolidge, one of his first patents was this ductile tungsten. When my wife and I were interviewing his son Lawrence, Coolidge actually made GE probably about $100 million in today's dollars. At the time, got $1 for the invention. He was given $1 for the patent, rather. But this was a huge win for GE producing these tungsten filaments. And in fact, you can go and look at the patents and such. They're able to string these light bulbs. And you can still see these in the antique stores out there. These very fragile filaments would now produce light, and they would last a lot longer. And it was really a great invention. And GE really moved through the years producing various types of light bulbs and such. Here's Edison with Coolidge and their production facilities, how they're extruding the tungsten filaments, the process of materials, the equipment. Edison was also very profoundly deaf, so he's probably yelling at Edison there, just telling him what's going on. And about the same time, about 1911, 1912, Coolidge has the idea of, and he was utilizing tungsten for targets for some of the X-ray tubes they were making, of putting this filament in the cathode and putting a separate circuit on this to produce a field of electrons, many more electrons around the cathode, and have a hot cathode to produce this X-ray beam. And that's in fact what he did. And he has there's a journal entry in his lab notebook, I think it was December 12th, 1912. And very shortly after that, Coolidge announces his hot cathode X-ray tube. And this tube really was a huge innovation. They could get much higher vacuums on the tube. They were much more stable. They were able to basically, with this hot cathode, produce a great number of electrons in a very short period of time. X-rays at the time with these old cold cathode tubes, it would literally, you'd have to hold the patient still. The hand would have to be still, or the head would have to be still, the arm, whatever. And it took a long time to produce this image, and you would get blurring from organ motion and such. But in a fraction of a second with one of these tubes, you could get the same amount of X-rays and freeze organ motion and such. So it was a great innovation. It was recognized as such. First demonstration was down in New York City. Coolidge patented this hot cathode X-ray tube, and quickly this became the standard in the industry. And it was just, again, you know, and you go to a dentist, you go to a medical for a medical procedure, chest X-ray, a CAT scan, mammography, whatever that procedure is. It is basically the same X-ray tube today as Coolidge invented back in 1912, 1913. And here's Coolidge in his laboratory with racks of X-ray tubes. He was a very hands-on physicist and did a lot of this work with himself and his team. But he always, as Coolidge's son told us, he was very loved by his co-workers and colleagues. And this is a patented portable Coolidge X-ray, a portable X-ray unit, Coolidge X-ray unit. And this is actually what sort of got me interested in Coolidge. I actually found one of these this is all wooden stand, portable Coolidge X-ray outfits in an antique store in Ohio back in the mid 1990s. And I started researching Coolidge at that point, but this is a really interesting portable X-ray tube. You notice there's no shielding here on the X-ray tube. Here's some old GE photographs of the use of these portable X-ray tubes in a hospital clinical situation. And think of the time frame. World War I was just ramping up at that point in time. And there was a lot of field use of X-ray tubes to look for bullets and such. Here's another stereo card of a field hospital in France at the time. Some of the folks viewing this may know that Madame Curie gave up her work, radium research work at the time, and built all these trucks with her daughter Irene to produce X-rays. To actually went out to the front and actually X-rayed Army personnel that were in need of X-rays and diagnosis of where the bullets were and such. Interestingly, she reached out to GE at the time, and Coolidge's son tells us this story that the GE was sending her X-ray tubes, but they were coming in broke. And somebody came up with the idea, well, why don't we just do an open crate so people can see it's a glass tube in there and they'll handle it. And they did. They handled it more gently, and the tube started coming in, and she was able to use these Coolidge tubes in her work during the First World War. Interestingly, Coolidge and Madame Curie corresponded. And in fact, when Madame Curie came to America, I think it was the second time in the 1920s, she came and she actually visited with Coolidge. They actually got her off a train because she was so ill and frail, and so many people were waiting for her at the train stop. They got her off the train early up in Amsterdam, New York, and snuck her into Coolidge's house. And Coolidge's son tells me the story when he and his sister got home from school, that the mother says, well, you'll never guess who's upstairs in the bedroom, Madame Curie, who was an amazing woman. And that's a whole nother story, which we hope to tell in the near future too here, but amazing woman, Madame Curie. I mean, I think Coolidge actually visited Madame Curie's laboratory also at one point. So another invention, and Coolidge had over 80 patents to his name. And in fact, he was inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame in his own lifetime, and the only one up to that point in time. He invented a stereo apparatus. If you offset a camera, you know, these stereo cards, and you look at that image, you could get this three-dimensional sense of three dimensions just by offsetting. So he invented an X-ray tube for that, and you could view these cards. And I have some of these stereo X-ray cards in my collection. Early applications of Coolidge X-ray tubes, dental use of X-rays early on. This is a Coolidge tube, and you can see here there's a on the anode side there's a radiator type of metal discs that are stacked up there, because again, the great heat loading that has to be dissipated, because most of the energy is deposited as heat, and only a fraction comes off as X-rays. And you can see here, though, even in the 20s, they're starting to use collimators and shielding the tubes up. There's a lead shielding around here protecting the operator. And again, you know, greatly utilized for looking for cavities, for fractured abscesses and such. Again, the application of X-rays in dental is just amazing. Boxing, I'm not sure who this Max Bears boxer was. I guess he was a heavyweight champ, but here's again a Coolidge X-ray outfit being utilized to check his hand out before a boxing match in the mid-30s. And again, as they got smarter as time went on, started using lead-loaded glass balls to drop these X-ray tubes in to protect the operators and the patients from any stray radiation that may come out of the tube, and just focusing the X-rays out the bottom through a collimator type of situation. Coolidge himself, during his work with X-rays, and this is well documented in one of his biographies, actually lost the hair on the back of his neck. He had so much radiation exposure experimenting with these X-ray tubes that he actually lost the hair on the back of his neck at one point in time, which is we call epilation, but you know, not a good thing. You don't. That's a fair amount of radiation X-rays exposure. And in fact, in the late 20s, the National Bureau of Standards was forming an X-ray and radium protection committee, and Coolidge was on that committee with a number of other famous physicists at the time, producing some of the first radiation protection standards for X-rays and radium. And they kept pushing, the GE lab kept pushing the energies. You know, we were initially with these initial Coolidge tubes were about 100,000 volts or 100,000 kilovolts. And they kept stacking and staging these devices so that they would get higher and higher energies, because they wanted to treat tumors, deep-seated tumors also, for what we call teleradiation therapy. So they kept building bigger and bigger X-ray tubes. And this is again some of their promotional photos that I have. And these were just big machines producing high energy X-rays for industrial radiography or medical therapy. Here's Coolidge out in Chicago with at the controls of a fairly high energy X-ray machine. And this is sort of the typical circa 1940 radiographic type of X-ray room. And you can see here the wires are well shielded. Some of the problems they had in the 20s and 30s was some of these cables were not well insulated, and a lot of operators were getting electrocuted. So again, as the technology progressed, here's Coolidge with a 1 million electron volt X-ray tube. Those tubes again were stages to continue to emit the X-rays and kick the energy up as it goes down the tube, and eventually hits a target at 1 million electron volts. And actually, GE had some other researchers out there doing work. Don Kirst is a famous physicist, ended up, I believe, in Iowa or Indiana. But he invented a circular type of a device to accelerate electrons for producing X-rays. It became known as a betatron. It was used widely in the 50s and early 60s. Some of them may have been even used for therapy, but here's a good example of that. And again, I just did this the other day. I don't know where I saw this. They were going to give it a German word, and I challenge anybody to pronounce that in one breath. But I did a Google translation: extraordinary high-speed electron evolving heavy-duty Bolegatron. That may have been how they came upon. Let's just call it a Betatron. Again, here's Coolidge, a photo of Coolidge in his laboratory working. And there's actually some films out there. You can see Dr. Coolidge on YouTube. I believe this link is still good. If you just Google William D. Coolidge X-rays YouTube, you should get to this film. It's about a 15-minute film. Coolidge himself describing the use of X-rays in various applications. During the Second World War, these high-energy X-ray tubes were utilized for looking at castings, looking for defects, cracks in these various large components and that were used in the war effort, and castings and such, and weldings too. So widely used in industrial radiography. GE also, in addition to X-ray tubes and such, were innovators in radio and TV. Here's an early scene of Coolidge doing a TV broadcast in 1940, local TV broadcast, WGY. Where I actually grew up in upstate New York and used to watch listen to their radio station and such. Again, on the 50th anniversary of Coolidge's of the discovery of X-ray, Coolidge made a recording. I think it was a radio broadcast. His son let me borrow a 78 RPM record. And Coolidge describes meeting Röntgen and all the uses of X-rays over the years and such. And it's really a wonderful recording. It's about 7 minutes. I converted it to a digital format. At some point, I've got to figure out a way to get this up on YouTube and such, and just have an audio recording so that can play. But it was really a wonderful loan from Dr. Coolidge, that record. Coolidge got a lot of awards over the years: the Franklin Institute, the Edison medal, the honorary medical degree he got. Also, probably a dozen or so awards and medals over the years for his various inventions and such. And again, I mentioned earlier he got the Hall of Fame, inducted into the Inventor Hall of Fame in his lifetime. Here's and then another photograph. I think it was a promotional photograph of Willis Whitney, who was the first director of the R&D lab. Coolidge became the R&D lab director and then vice president during the 40s. And then Guy Suits came in as director after Coolidge retired in the 40s. Actually, Coolidge stayed, he stayed working actively through the Second World War and was actually involved. FDR appointed him to the Uranium Committee that evaluated the use of uranium in producing the atomic bomb. That committee recommended pursuit of that research. And I think Coolidge actually went out to Hanford as GE produced the first started to produce the first significant quantities of plutonium during the Second World War out in Richland, Washington. And interestingly, I gave this talk in 1995 at the GE R&D lab, and as I was out there, here's a painting done by Norman Rockwell of Coolidge, Guy Suits, and Willis Whitney. And I actually corresponded a couple of years ago with the curator for the Rockwell Museum in Western Massachusetts, and she gave me some interesting correspondence. It took a couple of years to get Rockwell to actually finish this painting, and they were really stressed about it. But yeah, here's Norman Rockwell's painting. It was hanging right in the lobby there. The GE laboratory actually used to give, I believe they still do, one of their researchers a year off sabbatical. It's the Coolidge Award. It's their top award in the GE R&D lab. Coolidge retired again after the Second World War, began to travel. He and his wife, this is actually his second wife. His first wife passed after they had a son and a daughter, and Coolidge's and his wife then began traveling to South America, Europe. I think they went to the Himalayas at one point. But he continued to live in the Schenectady area and was really for many years. You see articles pop up on Dr. Coolidge. He lived to be 100 years old, and they really worshipped Coolidge at the GE R&D laboratory. And here's a birthday cake they did for Dr. Coolidge in 1973. There's 100 tungsten lamps on that birthday cake, and there is an X-ray anode, and mounted in that X-ray anode is a diamond, because they were, at that point in time, GE had figured out how to do industrial diamonds. And here is Mr. Boucher, the new director of the R&D lab in the early 70s, presenting Coolidge with his birthday cake. So a lot of fun there. In fact, one of my professional associations, the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, their top science award is the Coolidge Award. And they presented Dr. Coolidge in 1972. The first Coolidge Award, and this is a very prestigious award that the AAPM gives every year. So, Dr. Coolidge passed away in 1975. What a great life! What a great invention! What a just absolutely, you know, if I could go back in time, there's several people I'd want to visit with, and definitely Dr. Coolidge would be one. Madame Curie, Dr. Coolidge. Okay, so just a quick couple slides here, and I'll finish up, and we can have a few minutes for some Q&A. But yeah, as with everything, there's always sort of quackery, and some of these B films in the 50s. If you probably look for this on Netflix or whatever, you'll probably find this old X-ray tube, or rather this old film, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes. Here's Don Rickles. Actually was in this movie. He was a famous comedian, crazy comedian. But seriously, the applications of X-rays, industrial radiography, looking at pipes, looking at welds, the benefit of these laboratory type of radiography, industrial radiography. They actually radiographed the Liberty Bell before they moved it from Independence Hall to the new setting across the street. And Vince Roding just passed away, God bless him. He was the fellow who did that industrial radiography. And really wonderful guy, and we miss him. But he used to kid when he gave his Liberty Bell talk that he was the last person to ring the Liberty Bell, because this is a rather large bell. He used to have his head up there, and he kept banging his head inside the Liberty Bell as he was taping all the film up there. But even today, you know, with all the oil and gas industry and such, and checking welds through industrial radiography with X-rays or radioactive materials is a huge effort. When the airplanes were starting to be, terrorists were starting to take over airplanes back in the 70s. Security scanners became big. They continued to be big. They actually started utilizing X-rays, and they had looked at the characteristics of the materials that the X-rays were going through. And they could tell, in addition to whether there was weapons, but they could also tell if there was, say, C4, some explosive material in there. And we all see these widely used today in airports. And in fact, back in the circa 2012 timeframe, they were actually using backscatter X-rays, looking at the surface of the body for weapons and contraband and such. Those have since gone away. Now, mostly the time you see in airports are these millimeter waves. It's non-ionizing. But on the other hand, we are seeing in prisons and jails and such the use of the transmission X-rays. These are low current, low dose to the inmate, and they're looking for contraband, drugs, weapons, telephones, that sort of thing in these jails and prisons. X-rays are widely used in research, diffraction on various rocks, crystals, and DNA. Rosalind Franklin, her image was actually utilized by Watson and Crick for determining the structure of DNA, and they got a Nobel Prize. Sadly, she passed and wasn't able to share that Nobel Prize with Watson and Crick. Again, analysis, these characteristic X-rays, you can look at various metals and materials and look at the type of characteristic X-rays and determine quantitatively, you know, the ratios of metals and various alloys. Dental, again, evolving from the 20s, the early use of X-rays. We all have had bite wing X-rays over our lifetime. Sometimes we'll have a panoramic if you're having braces put on or something. But now with implants and such, we actually have cone beam computed tomography, where we can do three-dimensional reconstructions of a jaw if we're going to get an implant and such. And your classic medical setting, fluoroscopy, where you can look at organs, you can look at materials, barium, say, pass through the upper GI or lower GI. You can do a chest X-ray looking for lung cancer and such. Breast mammography, I'm very passionate about this. My mom had breast cancer, 2 sisters-in-law. Fortunately, everybody was fine, but very critical. Women, begin in their 40s, talk to their doctor, and begin getting early detection of cancer. Breast cancer is key for treatment, and the FDA we work closely with the FDA and make sure all that equipment is working perfect and operators are getting their training, QC, QA. So in the last bone density, so they use dual energies, 2 different types of energies to scan bones. Women and men start losing calcium as they get older and reach menopause, and you can lose calcium. And now they have treatments for that. So it's key, in addition to mammography, that women get bone scans, baseline bone scans, and as they reach menopause. In one of the last slides here, computed tomography. I remember early in my career as a medical health physicist at a medical center in upstate New York, I remember the first head unit that came in. And it was the money from the Beatles, all the Beatles' success, EMI, that actually funded Hansfeld, who did the research on the first CAT scanners, these first head scanners. And we can thank the Beatles for the computed tomography. And now we can see organs slices, and we can do 3-dimensional reconstructions and the sensitivity for detecting cancer and such. And we're actually now melding computed tomography with what we call PET scanning, where you have radioactive material emitted. And so you can actually do, in addition to anatomical, you can do functional imaging with these fusion PET CT units. And I think this is the last slide. The energies keep getting pushed up. We have high energy photon electron machines for deep cancer therapy. We're actually sort of back to the future, where we're using superficial X-rays for skin cancer. And in fact, some of the radioactive material used in what we call brachytherapy or close therapy for, say, cervical uterine cancer, we actually have small X-ray tubes that can be utilized. And lastly, and UPenn has one of these, and I think there's one going in Lancaster here. We have a large proton machine, and these machines accelerate protons for, say, prostate cancer. You can deposit a lot of energy at depth and spare a lot of the healthy tissue. And they're even talking about heavier ions for doing therapy there. So just want to mention a few of my professional organizations, the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors, which are all my counterparts out in the state government. Again, I want to honor all the radiologic technologists, the radiologists, the physicists, the radiation control program staff that are out there protecting the public from X-rays and radioactive materials, the CRCPD, Health Physics Society, the AAPM, all organizations concerned with protection, allowing the beneficial uses of X-ray and radioactive materials, but yet protecting the public. I did want to do this presentation for my staff this spring. We were going to have an all-hands meeting. I'm going to do a shout out here to my folks. I feel honored to be sort of steering the ship for the past 20 plus years here at the Pennsylvania DEP Bureau of Radiation Protection. Great staff. I just want to thank everybody for all their hard work over the years.